There were 10 unique comic-related items released in 1937 that were either one-shot releases, promo items, or weekly comic tabloids. Action Comics Ashcan from DC Comics, released sometime in 1937 or 38. This gruesome Craig Flessel cover graces the comic that was used to register the trademark and logo for Action Comics, where only a few months later Superman would have his historic world premiere. The source for this and most other DC Ashcans was Sol Harrison, who worked for DC Comics for 35 years. Very few Ashcans were created to begin with, and of these only a tiny fraction remain. Even more unusual is that this is the only Ashcan whose cover art was not recycled from published art. Only 3 copies of the Action Comics Ashcan are known to exist. One of those is in the permanent archives of DC Comics, and the other is in the hands of a longtime Ashcan collector. It has a black and white cover and black and white interior. It was printed on glossy Velox interior paper with a Velox cover. It was stapled. It is an Ashcan published by National Allied Publications, an Ashcan edition created to secure the trademark of title and logo. A second version would be made called Action Funnies. The cover is by Craig Flessel, and the cover was originally intended for Detective Comics number 2, but never used. The interior contents include 10 pages of Slam Bradley from Siegel and Schuster, their detective mystery story, which was reprinted from Detective Comics number 1. And Speed Saunders in a 6-page story from Craig Flessel, and the Detective Comics number 1 was also the origin of this story. In the early days of comic publishing, the most common procedure to secure a trademark for a potentially valuable title was to create an Ashcan edition of the proposed comic. Companies would simply create the title's logo, affix it to a piece of existing cover art, and then shoot a Velox of it. A Velox is a positive photograph print typically used by newspapers as a pre-press proof, which accounts for Ashcan covers being black and white rather than color. After the cover was created, it was trimmed to comic book size and then stapled to the interior of a previously published book, or sometimes just some loose story pages. The Ashcan was now complete. For all practical purposes, it had the appearance of a legitimate comic book, and since the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office apparently accepted them as authentic comic books for trademark registration, no higher authority in the country existed to dispute the claim. Action Funnies Ashcan edition from DC Comics, dated either 1937 or 38. It's believed that early DC executive Harry Donenfeld had 4 Ashcans created to protect the most important title in comic book history: Action Comics, Action Funnies, Double Action Comics, and Triple Action Comics. Unlike some Ashcans, the cover art was not taken from a previously published comic, but is art that was later used as the cover to Action Comics number 3, and the interior is from Detective Comics number 10. Crackajack Funnies Giveaway Comic is a one-shot and a multi-meal promotional comic from 1937. It features G-Man, Freckles, Dan Dunn, Buck Jones, Major Hoople, the Nebs, and other comic strips. The cover features the characters Speed Bolton, Dan Dunn, Clyde Beatty, Freckles, and Buck Jones. Dan Dunn is featured in a 4-page story from writer-artist Norman Marsh. And Speed Bolton Air Ace is a 4-page story from artist Alden McWilliams. And Al McWilliams, born February 2nd, 1916, lived until March 19th, 1993, an American comic artist who created the first African-American lead character of a comic strip. He started at Dell Comics on Crackajack Funnies and also contributed to the Funnies and the radio show spin-off Gangbusters in Popular Comics and 4-Color Comics. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1942, fighting in such World War II battles as D-Day, for which he was awarded the Bronze Star. He both wrote and drew the Quality Comics War Comics features Spitfire in Crack Comics and numerous titles in Military Comics. He drew the detective feature Steve Wood in Quality's National Comics. He later worked on the sci-fi stories in Planet Comics, the sports-oriented Fight stories, and the aviation adventure Wings. In 1952, he created the sci-fi comic strip Twin Earths, which ran until 1963. McWilliams and writer John Saunders' Dateline Danger, which ran from 1968 to 74, introduced the first African-American lead character of a comic strip, Danny Raven, co-star of this adventure series about two intelligent agents working undercover as reporters. McWilliams would also work on other titles such as Star Trek and Buck Rogers. Smokey Stover, Firefighter of Foo, number 1010, published in 1937 by Western, a 68-page comic with a 5-cent nickel cover price. Color cover with black and white interior. The dimensions were 5 and 9/16 by 7 and 5/16. It's a hardcover edition book, and the cover art is by Bill Holman of Smokey Stover. Smokey Stover is featured in 63 pages of comic strips. The humor title from Bill Holman, reprinting daily newspaper strips from Chicago Tribune and New York News Syndicate. 100 Pages of Comics, number 1, published by Dell Comics in 1937. This is a one-shot with no cover date. It's a 100-page giant square-bound with a 10-cent cover, featuring characters such as Wash Tubbs, Captain Easy, Major Hoople, Alley Oop, Tom Mix, and Tailspin Tommy. The series featured reprints from the 3 current Dell Comics ongoing series. It featured a Tom Mix cover. Hal Forrest gave us 4 pages of Tailspin Tommy, and Norman Marsh gave us 3 pages of Dan Dunn with art by J.R. Williams. Drums of Doom from United Feature Syndicate, published in 1937. It's a no-number one-shot. Features a skull cover by Lieutenant F.A. Methot, and Golden Thunder appears in the story. This is debatably the first horror comic book cover theme ever. A hefty 25-cent cover price at the time for this one-shot. He was advertised in a package deal with subscriptions to Tip Top Comics in Boys Life magazine. Vertigo, a novel in woodcuts by Lind Ward, published in New York through Random House in 1937. The first edition features 230 woodcuts, patterned clothboards, in a black slipcase with black lettered title label to front of case. A Depression-era story told entirely in woodcuts, without any text at all. 500 pages hardcover book, black and white interior. The dimensions are 5 3/4 by 8 1/4. This is an early graphic novel, and all the story pages appear on the right-hand page, with the verso pages blank on the left. All the artwork is by Lind Ward. The series topics in the stories presented in this illustrated format are quite mature, including drunk driving, engraving, the Great Depression, unemployment, and woodcutting. Gulf Funny Weekly, published by Gulf Oil Company from 1933 to 1941, saw approximately 50 new issues published in 1937, approximately number 197 to 245. The entire comic was 4 pages long and had a format of 10.5 by 15 inches. The comic was given away at Gulf gas stations, making them probably the first comic book published and distributed outside of the newspaper market. The comic was advertised on radio, telling people to go to Gulf gas stations to get them when it debuted in April 1933. Some of the highlight comic strip contributors are Stan Schendel, who did The Uncovered Wagon, also Curly and the Kids, and Smilage. These were 1 full-page, full-color comics. Much to everybody's surprise, the comics proved a very effective draw to the gas stations. People were quickly coming in and snatching them up. Gulf decided to print out 3 million copies a week and had the name changed to Comics Funny Weekly. The series remained in tabloid size and lasted 422 issues, ending on May 23, 1941. Even Edgar Church and Davis Crippen collected this series, and there are pedigree copies from both collections. Crimco Comics. Number 67 through 118 were published in 1937. This was a promotional comic book for Crimco, a chocolate-flavored milk drink featured in 2 pages of ads. The issues were partial color, 16 pages in total, all newsprint, 8 1/4 by 11 inches in size, published on behalf of the Crimco Company by the Better Cartoons Bureau, Wright Wrigley Building in Chicago. The local dairy bottling Crimco had exclusive charge of the comics to Crimco customers. The cover story features Lola the Lost Flyer, and later in the year the title changes to Lola the Secret Agent, and Lola could possibly be the first female detective in modern comics. Wags UK was an American publication that was sold and distributed in England. It was a weekly tabloid, and the first 51 issues were released in 1937, and it would run a total of 88 issues, ending in 1938. The first 16 issues were full color, and it featured 16 pages, and the remainder would be black and white, starting with issue 17. The dimensions were 10.5 by 14 3/4 inches. Characters include Tarzan, Moon Mullins, Bronco Bill, the Comic Zoo, and many others. An Australian edition debuted first in 1936 and was longer running, the British version debuting in 1937. The title would eventually feature comic strips by Bob Kane, Will Eisner, and Frank Willard, among others. Many of the comic strips would appear in USA publications, but from various publishers. The publication itself had a unique history. It was a transcontinental production, conceived, put together, and printed in the US, but sold and distributed in Great Britain and Australasia. In total, 181 monthly comic books were published during 1937 in the United States, plus these other extras brings the total to over 330 publications in 1937.